Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Colorful Caleb, and today I will be giving you the weird news in no particular order, starting off with a man who blew up his kitchen while trying to swat a fly. In the second segment, my main story will be that one of the California wildfires ravaging the West was actually started by a gender reveal party. The main story in the third segment is going to be about a church leader who claims that coronavirus is God's punishment for same-sex marriage, who ended up testing positive for coronavirus. We'll get to that and more, and then in the last section I will give you my top 10 greatest warriors of all time. I don't know why I'm doing that for a Weird News podcast, but it interests me. I hope it does you too. But for now, let's jump into the man who blew up his kitchen trying to swat a fly. This all began one hot afternoon in France, when an 82-year-old had just sat down to dinner in his house when he became annoyed by a buzzing bug. The Frenchman began to swat the fly with an electric racket, not realizing that a gas canister was leaking inside the house. Of course, the reaction between the electric fly swatter and the leaking gas caused a reaction. The resulting explosion brought down part of the kitchen and partly damaged the roof of the man's house. Fortunately, the 82-year-old man managed to escape without major injuries, although he did sustain burns to his hand and was transported to a hospital for a checkup. He said that while his house is temporarily uninhabitable, he will be staying at a local campsite, and his family members are repairing his house for him. Isn't that sweet? Unfortunately, there are no reports on whether or not the fly actually survived the whole ordeal, but I think it's safe to say he'll be looking for a new home to torture. This is, of course, not the first time that a small bug has caused a major disaster for homeowners. In 2018, a man in California set his parents' house on fire while trying to burn some spiders. And in that same year, an Australian blew up his house while trying to burn cockroaches. A police spokesman said on that case, quote, "It looks like the guy was using pet spray in the kitchen. Then a flame was lit, which caused a small fire, which later caused the house to blow up. What I heard happened was the explosion caused the stove to fire up, and it hit him in the chest. The victim's mother was injured too." So, just note to self, never use explosives when you can use, like, a roll of toilet paper or something. Okay, next story. A son sells 28 years of birthday whiskey in order to buy his first home. I'm going to mention this guy's name only because he's a genius. Matthew Robinson, who was born in 1992, has, over the course of his life, received about 5,000 pounds per year on 28 bottles of Macallan single malts. The boy has been saving these bottles, and they are now in total worth over 40,000 pounds. So this all began to stock up and pile up because the old man gave his son the bottles starting from age 1. And I'm pretty sure that in England you can't drink till you're 18. So, as the now 28-year-old son says, quote, "Probably wasn't the best gift for a young boy, but with strict instructions never to open them. Each year I received it as a birthday present. I thought it was quite a quirky little present as I was slightly too young to start drinking, specifically 5,000-pound drinks, but I was under strict instructions never to open them, and I tried my hardest and succeeded, and they are all intact." The boy's father, who is from Scotland, it's all starting to come together, who was from Scotland, said that the first bottle of 1974 whiskey was brought to, quote, wet the baby's head. I can think of several jokes, but any one of them would get me fired. He goes on to say, quote, I thought it would be interesting if I bought one every year and he'd end up with 18 bottles of 18-year-old whiskey for his 18th birthday. It wasn't the only present he got from us. It was just meant to be a unique present, but it was a little bit of luck that we kept it going. Since the first gift was given, experts say that Macallan has become a collectible drink, and Matthew is hoping to sell his collection for £40,000 as previously stated, and use the money for a house deposit. It is being sold by a whiskey broker who has described it as, quote, a perfect set. So if you're interested in a perfect set of 28 bottles of Macallan whiskey for £40,000, then go for it. Quote, the value of Macallan has risen massively over the last 5 to 10 years. To have such a vast collection of bottles is the real selling point of these. It's not the alcohol, it's the bottles. And he also said that he has, quote, a lot of interest already. Of course you do, dummy. You're being interviewed by a news station. Okay, next story. And this one's a bit controversial. Barbie announces a new doll for Dia de Muertos. Now, for those who don't speak Spanish, like myself, Dia de Muertos is actually the Day of the Dead, which this year pops up around October 31st. I believe that's every year, actually. And for those who also don't know, like me, it's the time of year when families remember their dead relatives with offerings of traditional foods, parades, and nightly visits to cemeteries. It is known as a beautiful and colorful holiday for Mexicans, and in recent years, the holiday has entered the mainstream with movies like Disney's Coco and The Book of Life depicting the Mexican traditions in a positive light. However, despite entrusting the doll's design to a Mexican-American designer, there has been some backlash online debating whether the Barbie collection is watering down a sacred holiday and a 3,000-year-old tradition. Some are accusing Barbie of cultural appropriation. Goodness gracious. Now, I did a quick scan on social media, and I don't see such hate going for this Barbie. In fact, I couldn't find a single comment that was not positive about it. So, let me know what you guys think, because that's what I want to know, is your opinion on a Barbie. Okay, next story. 2 massive pythons fall through an Australian man's ceiling. I'm kind of surprised this isn't my Florida story of the week, but nevertheless, we'll continue with it. A resident returned home to find a big hole in his ceiling. He knew it wasn't because of any recent storms or rain, because there hadn't been any recent storms or rain. Quote, he just knew straight away it was a couple of big snakes that he'd seen previously hanging around. I love Australians. They go on to say, quote, he knew they'd be in his house, so he went on the search to find them. And he did. He found 2 coastal carpet pythons, one under a cupboard and one near the front door. One snake was 2.9 meters long, or about 9 feet long, and weighed 10 kilograms, while the other snake was just over 2.5 meters long and about 8 kilograms. This is quickly becoming one of my new nightmares now. Just the fact that I have to worry about snakes falling through my ceiling. Quote, we have a lot of bush around here. I'm going to read that again. We have a lot of bush around here, so you don't see snakes. But I'd never seen snakes of that size. The only time they can be a little bit aggressive, well, I call it defensive, is if they get a stomach full of food. Other than that, they're just placid, harmless python that just continues doing what it does, and it doesn't really matter if people are watching it. I like how he has to point out that the only times they get aggressive is when they're murdering something. If you can't tell, I don't like snakes. The person who caught the snake said, quote, a lot of carpet pythons that are seen people like to have around their house. They don't mind that they're in their ceilings or anything like that because it's nature's rodent trap. Which is of course true, however, it turns out you don't actually want rodent traps falling on you in the middle of the night through your ceiling. Not fun. Quote, statistically, 1 in 3 houses in Queensland, Australia has one in their roof. A lot of carpet pythons that are seen people like to have around their house because they act as part of a self-defense system. Now, I would personally take a gun over this just to protect myself from snakes. Anyway, the snake catcher says he thinks that the snakes likely fell through the house because they were fighting over a female during breeding season. But he said that he was unable to check the ceiling to see if there were any more snakes because there wasn't enough room to look. That's not very reassuring at all. But he did go on to say that the female is likely outside by now, scared by all the commotion. When asked how he retrieved the snakes, he said, quote, "I just pick them up, then place them into a bag, and they go in the bag themselves. Then just take the snakes to a new habitat and relocate them." Well, isn't that fine? Fine and dandy. Next story. Let's see if I have a Florida story of the week. I have a Florida story of the week. A Florida man allegedly fatally shoots his mom after arguments over orange juice air conditioning. Now, of course, this is a sad story. It occurred in Miami Beach, Florida, wherein a Florida man turned himself into the police after he allegedly shot his mother to death following a series of arguments involving a car, orange juice, and an air conditioning remote control. Now, if you ask me, unless the argument was about the mom driving her car over her son's wife, pouring orange juice in her wounds, and then beating her to death with the air conditioning remote, I don't think it was appropriate to shoot the mom over all this. Anyway, the 29-year-old murderer said, quote, "I killed her, take me to jail," when he called the police. He allegedly told detectives that a series of arguments led to the fatal shooting. Apparently, he wanted to borrow his mother's car, and she would not let him. After that fruitless argument, they then went on to argue about orange juice. That was their fruitful argument. Apparently, one of them had drank most of it and just left a little bit in the bottom. Yeah, that makes me angry too. Anyways, the son said that his mother actually threatened him with a knife, which thankfully was de-escalated, but when he asked for the air conditioning remote, it led to another argument, which led to the son shooting his mother multiple times. And in his tragic little epigram, he told investigators that he called 911 after realizing the gun was out of bullets. He was, of course, arrested and charged with second-degree murder, and booked into the correctional center. Given no bond, it is likely he will face life in prison. I don't like to end on sad stories, but we're going to anyways. So why don't you stay tuned to the next segment where I'll talk about some happy stories, like a California wildfire that was started by a gender reveal party. Doesn't that sound fun? Stay tuned for that, and later we will get to the church leader who claims that coronavirus is God's punishment for same-sex marriage, even though he tested positive for coronavirus, as well as my top 10 greatest warriors of all time. Stay tuned for all that and more.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, where a gender reveal party gets blamed for a California wildfire. Good gravy, a smoke-generating pyrotechnic device spotted at the gender reveal party started the El Dorado fire, which has now spread over 7,000 acres, making it one of more than 24 blazes across the state. Of course, California is currently experiencing a record heat wave, with Los Angeles reporting a highest ever temperature of 49.4 degrees Celsius or 121 degrees Fahrenheit. The National Weather Service described Sunday as, quote, one of the hottest days since weather records began across much of southwestern California. Last month, Death Valley National Park in California reported a temperature of 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which could be the highest reported temperature ever on Earth when it comes to those that have been reliably recorded. The largest fire known at the current moment is the Creek Fire, which has burned 73,000 acres. That's not the weird news. Where's the weird news? The El Dorado Fire, which is being blamed on a smoke-generating pyrotechnic device, otherwise known as a smoke machine, which was used during a gender reveal party, started the blaze. Quote, California Fire wants to remind the public that with the dry conditions and critical fire weather, it doesn't take much to start a wildfire. They go on to say, quote, people who cause fires can be held financially and criminally responsible. Now, this is the funny part, that this is not the first time a gender reveal party has started a fire. In April 2017, a gender reveal party in Arizona sparked a week-long wildfire which burned through 45,000 acres. The father at the gender reveal party has been given 5 years probation and asked to pay damages. Alright, that's pretty much it for that story. Next story. Papillion Europe's most wanted bear captured after 42 days on the run. So this is a brown bear nicknamed Papillion because of his propensity. Let me look that up. Propensity, an inclination or natural tendency to behave in a particular way. That is the most meaningless, pretentious word I've ever heard. Anyways, they've nicknamed him for escaping from its enclosure. However, he has been captured by rangers in the Italian province of Trento after 42 days of freedom. His more accurate code name, M49, brought out a statement that he was the most wanted bear in all of Europe. The 149-kilogram bear fled from the Casteller Center on the 27th of July after climbing over its enclosure, which had been reinforced following previous escapes. M49 was the most wanted bear in all of Europe and considered a, quote, escape genius. Italian authorities compared the bear to Papillion, the eponymous character from Henry Schereri's memoir about escaping from a French penal colony, which was released as a film in 1973 for those who don't know or don't care. An order was placed for the bear's capture, and it was issued on June 2019. The bear's capture was actually an executive order by the president of the Trento province, who declared that the animal was a risk to the humans after it was seen close to inhabited areas. They spelled inhabited wrong, not me. The bear's first escape took place on the 15th of July 2019, when the bear managed to climb over 3 electric fences and a 4-meter-high barrier at a wildlife enclosure in the northern Italian province. Goodness gracious. This bear clearly has some sort of superpower, and any of the people who captured him should be very afraid right now. After the escape, the authorities were granted permission to shoot the bear if it came close to inhabited areas. Quote, the fact that the bear managed to climb over an electric fence with 7 wires of 7,000 volts demonstrates that this specimen is dangerous and a public safety problem. I like how in Italy a bear is not considered dangerous unless it goes through electric fences. The animal which has been implicated in the killing of livestock was captured on the 29th of April. This was before his escape, but he remained in captivity for only 2 months before escaping again. After its recapture, its enclosure was reinforced, and the bear was fitted with a radio collar to monitor its movements in case of another escape. It was all for vain, as Papillion, who had become a symbol of freedom and a champion and the force of nature of humans, managed to escape again on the 27th of July and removed its own collar, making its capture even more difficult. I hope that they release a feature film about this bear, and that while he's escaping, all of the scouts are chasing after his radio collar. Then they find it, and it's like on the deck of a ranger or something. And it says, like, quote, who's the real predator? That would be funny. Anyway, it was finally caught last Monday after the animal was caught in a so-called tube trap, a device commonly used to capture bears, according to a note from local authorities. How many bears are they catching? Of course, the capture has incurred the wrath of the environmental groups, which have vowed to take legal action in order to free M49. According to the WWF, the accusations against the bear are unfounded. I happen to agree with this one. It's very rare that a bear attacks a human, so I kind of find it unfair to prosecute a bear before they've actually committed any crimes. Due process, people, that's all I'm saying. The Trento representative of the International Organization for Animal Protection, goodness gracious, has pledged to go on hunger strike for Papillion's release. Quote, "I've just taken the decision. We must save these bears. We are their voice. We will fight until M49 is free." I take back everything I just said. I kind of hope the bear eats this person. According to the WWF, M49 is not dangerous at all insofar as it has not shown aggression towards humans. Quote, "Papillion is an animal which is representative in the past to have only caused damage at the infrastructure at the zoo, and for this reason it needs to be monitored, not locked up." The bear's capture arose after a young male bear attacked a police officer in northern Italy last August, pouncing at him and knocking him to the ground in what witnesses described as an unprovoked attack. The incident was rekindled the debate on the presence of these animals in the region, which many consider too numerous, after their population dwindled to just 4 in Tenerentio. My weekly mispronunciation of the week. Brown bears were reintroduced into the area in 2000. The population currently stands at about 90. That doesn't sound like too much at all. It is unsaid at the current moment what will happen to Papillion. I think if he was killed, it would bring much an uproar to Italy. So he'll probably just be placed in a bigger cage. Perhaps one with 8,000 volts rather than 7,000. Okay, now next story. This one's... I'm going to warn you about this one. First of all, it's about trees, and second of all, it's really, really long. So if that's not your thing, go ahead and skip right ahead. We have more good weird news stories coming right up, but I personally love this one. It's about a, quote, body farm on which researchers are exploring whether the nutrients from human cadavers can change the look of plants, which authorities might be able to use to locate missing people. Holy God, I love this one. Since 1980, the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Center has plumbed the depths of its most macabre of science, the decomposition of human bodies. Known colloquially as the body farm, scientists are examining how donated cadavers decay, like how the microbiomes inside us go haywire after death. That microbial activity leads to bloat, and eventually a body will puncture, and out flows the body's nutrients, especially nitrogen, for plants on the body farm to subsume. And this prompted the relevant question, what if that blast of nutrients actually changes the color and reflectance of a tree's leaves? And if so, what if law enforcement authorities could use a drone to scan a forest looking for these changes to find deceased missing people? Today, in the journal Trends and Plant Science, they are formally floating the idea around, which, to be clear, is still theoretical. So don't get all excited about these body farms, people. In fact, the researchers are just beginning to study how a plant's physical characteristics might change if a human body is composing nearby. Quote, "What we're proposing is to use plants as indicators of human decomposition to hopefully be able to use individual trees within a forest to help pinpoint where somebody has died to help in body recovery." Now this is where we get all sciencey. As a large mammal like a human decomposes in a forest, its breakdown transforms the soil in a number of ways. The body's necrobiome, which is all the bacteria that was already in it when it was alive, replicates like crazy in the absence of an immune system. The necrobiome mixes with the microbes in the dirt. Quote, "The soil microbiome will change, and of course the plant roots will also sense some changes. But we don't really know what those changes are. That is what the study is for. Also, it is unclear how the gases emanating from a body might affect the plants in the area. Not to mention a cadaver attracts a horde of opportunistic critters that further complicate the dynamics at play. Scavengers like vultures might pick at a body, while flies might lay eggs, and hatch flesh-eating maggots. Isn't that fine and dandy? These larvae can appear in such numbers that another group of researchers found they form squirming rivers around pig carcasses left in the forest. Isn't that swell? Of course, visiting animals might also contribute their urine and feces to the noxious mix, which is all to say that while the soil microbial community will change, so too will the animal community above, with as yet undetermined effects on the plants in the vicinity. One factor that Stewart's team is considering is the cadaver's role in delivering nitrogen to the soil. As it decomposes, the body floods the ground with a chemical, and possibly even too much nitrogen. In fact, for some plant species like grass, which initially die back around a cadaver, it has become a well-known, clear indicator of where a body is hidden. In the longer term, this nutrient helps plants grow so the later vegetation bounces back, but how plants might bounce back, whether these plants look any different because of this infusion of nutrients, is unclear. Quote, surprisingly, nobody that I can tell has ever really studied this in any systematic way. That's because it requires bodies and a lot of time. And of course, people with bodies and a lot of time would likely not use those resources to study plants. Anyways, the scientist goes on to say, quote, right now for the body farm study, we're basically just taking the trees and shrubs that are growing naturally within our plots, then placing donors, as they refer to them, and then looking at leaf responses, plant responses at various distances. This work began only a few months ago, and the researchers don't yet have data to share, but they are hoping next year to take soil exposed to decomposing human bodies and apply it to plants in the greenhouse to see whether it changes the appearance of their leaves. Quote, a controlled study, a replicated study, which shall have results. Don't worry, folks, we're almost done. There are a few ways a leaf response could play out. For one thing, the leaves might reflect more or less light or change in color, getting greener or even red, for example. Quote, we're definitely looking at green, but we're also looking at all the wavelengths within visible light, and then also those on either side of the visible. So they're looking at light. That's their big revelation. However, they go on to describe further, quote, the chlorophyll in plants' leaves fluoresces, remitting light that special optics can pick up. This signature is invisible to the human eye, but not to existing technologies. It's known as hyperspectral sensing. However, he goes on to say that it's simply more difficult than just sensing the color. Quote, there would be a need to differentiate effects from human decomposition with those from other animals. Decomposition. Humans, after all, aren't alone among large mammals, hogs, deers, bears, you name it. And if it's rotting out there in the wild, flooding the soil with the same nutrients, a human cadaver might. He goes on to say, another challenge is the variability of decay. It's one thing to fly a plane over a forest and spot a cannabis grow operation in hyperspectral imaging, but that's very different than a randomly located dead person decomposing at an unknown rate. Any number of variables influence how a dead organism releases the nutrients and microbes that might affect surrounding vegetation, like how hot it is or how much moisture it is. All of this is a lot of background noise. They wrap up by saying, quote, the chances of all that nitrogen entering the soil is pretty low, because flies are going to consume tons of it. If a coyote comes along, it will consume a bunch of it. Vultures, crows, and all those organisms will be removing it. So, to say the least, he is not optimistic on if the study will work or not, but I'm sure he's happy that he has a job for the next 3 years. Okay. That is it for this segment. Stay tuned to the next segment, where I will talk about the Jelly Belly founder hosting an online treasure hunt in which the winner gets a candy factory, as well as a church leader who claims the coronavirus is God's punishment for same-sex marriage, even though he tested positive for coronavirus. We will get to that and more, and of course my top 10 greatest warriors of all time later. Stay tuned for it.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, in which the Jelly Belly founder is hosting an online treasure hunt, in which the winner gets a candy factory. By God, why am I wasting time recording? By the way, this also counts as a Florida story of the week. The founder of Jelly Belly is hosting a series of cash prize treasure hunts around the country before his retirement. Anyone that participates will then be eligible to search for the ultimate treasure, which is the key to one of his candy factories. If this sounds familiar, let's just say Gene Hackman is rolling around in his chocolate grave. According to a news release, the CEO and his partner have started going across the USA, holding, quote, gold-style tickets in the form of necklaces in places they come across with interesting stories. They go on to say the biggest and best prize of these treasure hunts is that anyone who joins at least one treasure hunt will be eligible to search the ultimate treasure, which will be the key to one of his candy factories and an all-expenses-paid trip and education to a candy-making university. Goodness gracious, they have that? Anyway, those who wish to get involved just need to pay an entry fee of $50 to get access to their state's clue. The company said that each treasure hunt is valued at $5,000 and only 1,000 people can participate in each treasure hunt. For your chance at this opportunity, go to thegoldenticket.com. I think I might do this myself. It sounds goofy and stupid, but it could be fun. You know, who doesn't want a free trip to a candy university? Alright, next story. The big story. The church leader who claimed that coronavirus is, quote, God's punishment for same-sex marriage, even though he tested positive. The Ukrainian religious leader claimed that coronavirus was God's divine punishment for same-sex marriages. The 91-year-old is head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev, one of the country's largest congregations. Of course, he was hospitalized last week after testing positive for coronavirus and has also developed pneumonia. His diagnosis was confirmed in a statement posted to Facebook last Friday. Quote, we inform that during planned testing, His Holiness Patriarch of Kiev and all Rush Ukrainian tested positive for COVID-19. Now, His Holiness Bishop is undergoing treatment at a hospital. Of course, the diagnosis most likely came as a surprise to His Holiness, given that he previously cast blame for coronavirus on LGBT plus people and same-sex marriages. Of course, it was only back in March that the Ukrainian bishop posted on national TV that the pandemic was, quote, God's punishment for the sins of men, the sinfulness of humanity. First of all, I mean same-sex marriage. The man's declaration, of course, attracted very heavy criticism from communities around the world who feared it would fuel anti-LGBT plus hatred among the man's 15 million followers at a time when the health crisis was already stoking tensions. A spokeswoman for Amnesty International Ukraine said, quote, such statements are very harmful because they could lead to increased attacks, aggression, discrimination, and acceptance of violence against certain groups. And on the 13th of April, the advocacy group Insight sued the Patriarch for his comments, the first such case of an ex-Soviet nation. The Insight's leader said, quote, our aim is to show people that there are no longer place for such statements from church leaders in Ukraine. They went on to demand disseminating false information from both the Patriarch and the TV channel that aired the interview. But the Patriarch refused to accept any wrongdoing, and the Patriarch's press service said in a statement, quote, "As the head of the church and as a man, the Patriarch has the freedom to express his views, which are based on morality. The Patriarchate reserved the right to bring counterclaims against those who sought to abuse judicial prosecutions and protections to encroach on Ukraine's traditional family values." As a result of his influence, many religious leaders are now blaming coronavirus on LGBT+ communities, prompting the World Health Organization to issue a warning about the spread of misinformation. That's all we have on that story for now. I'm kind of disappointed we didn't get a statement from the Patriarch himself. I'm going to continue following up on this story just because I feel incredibly invested. But I'm sure we'll get some answers soon. Next story. Giant house spiders the size of your hand are invading UK homes looking for love. And by love, I mean they are on a hunt for sexual partners as the mating season begins. Male house spiders venture indoors each autumn as they seek out warm, dry places, while on the lookout for females to be their mate. Of course, this means they can often be found in homes, sheds, and garages throughout the mating season in August and September. Their leg span measures up to 10 centimeters, or about 4 inches. Pretty spooky, about the size of a small hand, the creatures are one of Britain's biggest arachnid species and can even be the size of a small dinner dish. One of the ecologists from Nottingham Trent University said, quote, "The spiders can do 0 to 60 in 1 second. This time of year, the male spiders have the urge to mate and start wandering and looking for females. Quote, when they find them, they mate and she lays eggs and the male usually dies." Wow, I've never heard life summed up in 1 sentence, but that was pretty close. He went on to say that they can do 0 to 60 in 1 second, and people lose track of where they have gone. Although the spiders do have fangs, and the fangs can nip humans, they cannot actually kill humans. They are known as the house spiders, the daddy long legs, and the cross spider. Of course, with a name like Daddy Long Legs, you have to be a mating spider. But as previously stated, all of these species are harmless to humans. And, quote, "they play an important role in our homes by eating large quantities of flies and other insects." Well, isn't that fine and dandy? This next story is kind of goofy. It's about the FBI, who is horrified to discover that the Ring doorbells, those doorbells with cameras on them, can tip off citizens to the presence of federal officers at their doors. It is said that since Amazon required the company, Ring has cornered the law enforcement adjacent market for home security products. They have partnered with hundreds of agencies to get Ring's products into the hands of residents. A lot of this flows directly into the police departments, which can get them almost for free as long as they push citizens toward using Ring's Snitch app, Neighbors, and allow Ring to handle the PR work. So for those who don't know, the app Neighbors basically allows a community watch if multiple people in your community have the Ring system, which is just a camera on your doorbell, making it easier to catch criminals, those goddamn spooks who go around stealing packages. So obviously it sounds incredibly helpful. However, the FBI is concerned about Ring cameras, considering that the company's unabashed love for all things law enforcement. The FBI has posted warnings to cops about the threat Ring cameras pose to cops. After celebrating the golden age of surveillance the internet has ushered in, the FBI notes that doorbell cameras see everyone who comes to someone's door, even if it's people who'd rather the absent resident remain unaware of. In the FBI's document, they describe a 2017 incident in which the FBI agents approached a New Orleans home to serve a search warrant and were caught on video. Quote, "Through the Wi-Fi doorbell system, the subjects of the warrant remotely viewed the activity at his residence from another location and contacted his neighbor and landlord regarding the FBI's presence there. Routed out by the same security tech that is often pushed onto residents by law enforcement officers hoping to expand their surveillance networks by deputizing doorbells, Ring's cameras aren't just mute witnesses. Owners receive notifications when someone comes to their door. Depending on the model, they are able to hold conversations with them using built-in mics and speakers. This means the sneak and peek feds might have been overwhelmed discussing their tactical plans or specifics about the investigation. Another FBI document reads, subject was able to see and hear everything happening at his residence and possibly covertly monitoring law enforcement activity while law enforcement was on the premises. The FBI. The FBI is so cool when you research their tactics and strategy, but when it comes to execution, they just become a toddler. They always throw fits at the smallest things. They went on to say, covert monitoring is the best monitoring. Many people have responded saying that it sucks when the FBI decides now is the time to be hot and bothered when security cameras have been catching cops visiting and raiding properties for years. Audio recording isn't anything new either, so if cops haven't been clued into this possibility already, they have no one to blame but themselves. Let me know what you think about this whole debacle. What do you think's more important, individual rights or the FBI not being snitched on by doorbells? Alright, going on to our last story of the week. And I was going to save this for my next episode just because I love the title. An Albany man is rescued from Lake George by priests on a floating tiki bar. It was supposedly a choppy afternoon on the lake when the Albany man was paddling in his kayak. He says, quote, I drifted away from my wife and stepkids because I was taking pictures with my new smartphone and not really paying attention. Well, you have to appreciate his honesty there. Eventually, he realized the situation he was in and tried to make his way back, but the water got choppier and he paddled harder before he tipped over and lost his paddle. The water was about 30 feet deep and his ill-fitting life jacket was said to have been coming up over his head and he was holding onto the kayak with one hand and his new $1,400 smartphone with the other. He would drown before he let that get any water damage. But I mean, if it's $1,400, you probably shouldn't have to worry about water. Anyway, he says other kayakers and canoeists were passing by in the distance, but the former amateur boxer's pride wouldn't let him scream for help. That's an odd little fact to push into that statement. But apparently for several exhausting minutes, he tried to put the kayak upright. Quote, that's when I said, all right, I think I might die today. I think this might be it. I prayed to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, for help. A lot of things aligned that day, thankfully. It was then that the captain of the Tiki Tour, which is like a little floating bar, noticed the struggling man, believing that he heard a cry for help. Quote, so as soon as I turned the boat towards him, I realized his life preserver had been in the upper position of his head, and he was hanging on for dear life. Thankfully, they got to him, and a deckhand and passengers pulled him on board, and the recovering alcoholic said, quote, how funny is it that I've been sober for 7 years and I get saved by a tiki bar? And then the crowd burst out into laughter. This was starting to sound like a movie, and apparently it was full of priests and seminarians from the Paulist Fathers, a Catholic retreat on the lake. The man prayed for help from above, and it arrived in the form of priests on a floating tiki bar. One of the seminarians said, quote, we're missionaries. For us that day, that was our mission, to be present and help someone in need. Wow, I like going out on a happy story. That doesn't happen too often. Alright, so if you stay tuned to the next segment, I'll give you my top 10 warriors. It has absolutely nothing to do with weird news, but it'll be a heck of a lot more interesting than just turning off the podcast altogether. So why don't you stay tuned for that?
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. Top 10 greatest warriors of all time. Number 10, Richard I, the Lionheart. Of course, he was the King of England for 10 years and one of the greatest warriors of his era. It's known through history that he ruled over Normandy, Cyprus, Brittany, Gascony, and Nantes. And he is one of the few kings that is actually known by his nickname rather than his number. Which is good because the Lionheart is a pretty goddamn good nickname, and it was given to him for his exceptional courage and war strategies. He began leading his own army when he was just 16 years old. The Lionheart became the main Christian leader against Saladin, who was a general for the Sunni Muslims of the time. There are many famous battles between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the most famous being known as some of the early wars of Jerusalem, but unfortunately the Lionheart could never capture it. But he was one of the only people to ever sign a peace treaty with Saladin, and therefore he returned to France. Okay, number 9, Saladin. It is well accepted in Western culture that Saladin is often portrayed as the villain in the Third Crusade, but the Kurdish Sultan is hailed in the Middle East as the hero who crushed the European Crusaders and returned Jerusalem into the Muslims' hands. Of course, that history is well debated, but that's not what we're focusing on today. Saladin was born as a commoner in 1138 in Mesopotamia. He founded the Ayyubid dynasty and became the first Sultan of Egypt and Syria in 1175. Only 37 years later. He was trained at a young age by his uncle, and in the early days of his military career, Saladin united the Arab forces. Even after taking over the government, Saladin personally led all the major military campaigns. Before his death in 1193, the Sultan gave away most of his wealth to the poor. He is known to be one of the greatest generals of the Middle Ages, decimating even the most overpowering enemies. Alright, number 8, Sun Tzu. Most of you have probably heard of him. He was the guy who wrote The Art of War in the 5th century BC, which is almost certainly the most read book on war. You have almost certainly heard many of his sayings, some of which are, quote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," or "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." And my personal favorite, quote, "In the midst of chaos there is also opportunity." One of the funny things about the book The Art of War is that it is now mostly used as a business book, because many of his strategies of war transfer perfectly over to the world of business, which I find both hilarious and beautiful. But that's not what makes him the greatest warrior, the 8th greatest warrior. It was in fact the fact that he was an ancient Chinese general who was revered for his military strategy, martial arts, and philosophy. In his most famous anecdote, he is known for having transformed his own king's concubines into a powerful military force. And of course, his book not only inspired many Asian rulers, but also inspired Henry Kissinger, Napoleon, and many other Western leaders. Alright, number 7. I'm gonna go ahead and get this fella out of the way. Hannibal of Carthage. If I had to choose personally, he would be my number 1. But since this is like the 8th time I've mentioned him on this podcast, I will put him at number 7. Of course, he's considered the greatest enemy of Rome, the most powerful nation to ever exist up to its own era. He led the Carthaginian forces in the Second Punic War, after first conquering the Alp Mountains. And he is even often described as the father of military strategy. He crossed the Alps with 37 war elephants and 46,000 soldiers. Modern historians are still not quite sure how he did that. And even more impressively, after entering the Roman territory, he harassed the Romans for more than a decade. In one of his most famous battles, he had 8,000 men and the Romans had 80,000 men, and his 8,000 surrounded the 80,000 and killed almost all of them. This was all due to his military strategy and genius, and he also destroyed hundreds of towns and won many battles before being defeated by Scipio Africanus in the Battle of Zama. We will get to Scipio later because I haven't talked about him enough. Scipio forced him to sign a peace treaty in 201 BC. And it's also well known that by the end of Hannibal's war efforts, he also hated Carthage. He was well opposed to the peace treaty, as he should have been, but we will get to that when we get back to Scipio. Alright, number 6, Julius Caesar. I find this person incredibly uninteresting just because all of his friends are way more interesting, but it's hard to dispute that he was almost certainly the greatest general in Roman history. He won many battles in Britain, Germany, and Gaul, which back then is what we know today as France. And he is also well known for documenting his military adventures, which nobody had really done up to that time. He came to power as a praetor and went on to become a consul and proconsul. And the most interesting part about him is that the Senate grew so uncomfortable with his power and influence that they asked Caesar to disband his forces. That is an astonishing amount of power. But of course he did not give up, because why would you? And eventually he became the dictator of Rome in 44 BC before being assassinated by all of his besties, which led to many more beautiful disasters. Number 6. Let's go back east to Miyamoto Musashi. He was born in 1584 and is known as the samurai wizard. That is the coolest title ever. And he earned it, being known as undoubtedly one of the greatest warriors to ever have walked the earth. Musashi was raised and trained by his uncle after his father's death. By the time he was 13, he was traveling across Japan, challenging some of the finest swordsmen of the era to duel. Miyamoto's father himself was trained swordsman and a martial artist. It is said that Miyamoto won more than 60 sword duels throughout his life and never suffered a single defeat. He is said to have died with a cane in one hand and a sword in the other, being that he took his sword to his final fight. And finally, he created the Nitioro technique, in which you fight with 2 swords, which is pretty cool. That just says a lot about his personality alone, right? That he thinks a good defense is largely subsidized by a great offense. He would rather take 2 swords than a sword and a shield, focusing entirely on attack. Okay, number 5, going back west to Spartacus, who to me is not as interesting for his fighting abilities as he is for his leadership skills, but I guess that's part of it in the end. He was born in 109 BC in Thrace, and of course he is the very, very, very pop culture famous gladiator who revolted against the Roman Empire. This was back when Rome was still at war with the Germanic people, and he decided to leave the army instead of fighting against the Germanics. The Empire was not happy with his decision, of course, so they captured him and sold him into slavery. Due to his strength, however, he ended up being sold as a gladiator. He and his followers continued to build an army of slaves, and eventually they had 90,000 strong. It's such a great story. He is one of the greatest warriors, not only because of his strength and war capabilities, but, of course, also for his courage and compassion. He was killed in the Battle of 71 BC. Number 4. We're going to put Leonidas at number 4. Leonidas the Brave of Sparta. Unfortunately, his early years aren't well documented, but it was likely very similar to everybody else who lived in Sparta. He was most likely brought up to be exclusively trained in combat. It is said that he is the direct descendant of Hercules, or Heracles, however you want to say it. He is best known for his heroic military adventures at the Battle of Thermopylae during the second invasion by the Persians in 480 BC, when of course he took his 300 Spartans to make up against Xerxes' armies of 7,000. Now, there's a bit of confusion there because he actually had a lot of other Greek soldiers with him. Some would say he had over 1,000, but it was still a very impressive feat, especially in terms of strategy. Of course, King Darius of Persia tried to conquer Greece for almost a decade when Leonidas became king. When King Darius died, his son Xerxes continued to lead the Persian army. Leonidas tried to stop Xerxes' armies at the pass of Thermopylae with his 300 Spartans, otherwise known as his personal guard. When some of Leonidas' soldiers betrayed him, most likely due to fear, he sent away most of his soldiers and kept only the 300 Spartans. They did not defeat Xerxes, but they took down many, many thousands of soldiers while they only lost the 300 there. Only one Spartan escaped. His name was Marathon. He ran a marathon all the way back to Sparta, where he quickly died after giving a message to the Spartans. Okay, number 3. Scipio the Younger, or Scipio Africanus. Or if you really want to make things complicated, Scipio Africanus the Elder. He took after his father, who was also named Scipio. The interesting part of his military career begins at the Battle of Cannae, which I mentioned earlier, in which Hannibal took 80,000 Romans with his army of 8,000. Scipio was young at the time. He was not a leader in that battle, but he was one of the survivors. His father and his uncle, who were both leaders, were eventually killed by Carthaginians who swept through Spain. Eventually, he assumed military leadership, and he was boldly determined to disregard Hannibal's presence in Italy and decided to strike Africa directly, taking an offensive stance approach to military rather than a defensive one, which was the Roman way at the time. However, most people didn't agree with him, so he actually had to come up with an army of volunteers. But he eventually landed in Africa with 35,000 men, and he besieged Utica. His attacks were so devastating that the Carthaginians sought for peace terms and forced Hannibal to return to Africa. He eventually faced Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, where, due to his spectacular cavalry commanding skills, he took down Hannibal's undefeated army. In honor of his victory, he was named Africanus, and then they besieged the great city of Carthage. While the Romans were sacking the city, one of the most beautiful things to humanize a general ever said in the early ages, Scipio began to cry as he watched Carthage city burn. When one of his fellow men asked why, he said that he sees Rome's future in the sacking of this city, basically saying that everything comes to an end, and it's always sad for somebody. Time to move on to number 2. We're going to do what I consider to be the less interesting of the two. Alexander the Great, who is arguably the greatest warrior of all time. And I think he is, actually. But not without the help of some other incredible characters, his mother and father, Philip II and Olympias. He was, of course, king of Macedonia, or Macedon. Between 336 BC and 323 BC, his empire spread from Greece all the way to India. He conquered Persia, Syria, the Balkans, Egypt, and many other regions, spending most of his early years under the tutelage of Aristotle. Alexander the Great fought on the front lines of almost every battle. He had also planned to invade Arabia, but he fell sick and died in 232 BC. This article has that wrong. It's actually 323 BC. Alright, better move on. There's not much more to talk about with Alexander the Great. He was just simply one of the greatest conquerors to ever live, if not the greatest. First, an honorable mention before we get to number 1 is one of the greatest warriors behind the scene, Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias. If you really dive deep into the story of Alexander the Great, it's pretty clear that she was really the one behind the scenes, making sure everything went smoothly, making sure Alexander never lost his power, making sure that even though their country was so great, it would never be decimated or divided into its own states. She's a very interesting character. But it's time for number 1. Of course, Attila the Hun. He was leader of the Steppes barbarian group called the Huns between 434 and 453. Many people don't like the fact that they're called barbarians, but that is actually the most accurate term. Not in a violent sense particularly, but just the fact that they were always on the move. They didn't really have a homeland. They would just go and pillage, plunder, conquer, and they were the most effective to have ever done it in the history of Earth. It is well known that even the great Eastern and Western Roman empires were scared of him. At his peak of his career, Attila's empire spread from the Rhine to the Ural, to the Danube, to the Baltic Sea, which for reference is more surface area than Pluto has. He was an absolutely brilliant and devastating conqueror. And I'll end with a little anecdote. He learned from history that when great leaders die, everything divides up, usually by the sons of the leader, and they all go to war, and it's a disaster. So he took all his sons aside one day, and he took an arrow out of his quill pack, and he broke it in half and said, wow, that was easy. And then he took out an entire stack of arrows, and he tried to break those. And he said, oh, I can't do this. See what I'm trying to say, boys? Alone you are all weak, together you are strong, and that's why I'm the greatest conqueror of all of ever. He might have said it in a different way, but that's pretty much all of it. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please subscribe and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you will find your latest GSMC Weird News updates. Please also leave us a review on the iTunes. That would be absolutely fantastic. Leave a comment below. That's just for me. It would make me smile. Shout out to Robbie Canton. Thank you, and have a good night.